I think that maybe this the only topic we haven't touched on yet is diving a little bit more into nothingness and somethingness.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so some people might wonder, what's wrong with the idea that there could have just been nothing and then something just came into being from nothing.
Yeah. Well, what do we mean by nothingness? Let's start there, maybe.
Yeah, that's nothingness is a very slippery concept, I think. It's very difficult to get clear. But most people would agree that, nothingness is like the absence of everything, right? Like a complete absence of anything that could exist. And a usual mental image is like empty space. But of course, there's space. So, but, but the problem is that any kind of conceptual representation incurs this kind of pulling back from nothingness. Because it's like, okay, you have an idea of nothingness. Well, the idea exists, right? Naming it, then you have a name. Giving it some kind of definition or rule that it has to abide by. Say absence. Okay, now there's absence, right? And so
Where is the absence?
well, that's yeah. Where is it? It's not there, right?
Well, I haven't seen it.
But yeah, so there's a kind of a difficulty with coming to grips with what exactly nothingness means. And some people will infer from this that it's a kind of transcendent reality where you can't conceptually, there's no way to get traction on it mentally, cognitively. But the thought is sometimes that doesn't in itself tell against, say, its possibility, whatever that means. And it's
Right. It sort of sounds like a Kantian noumena of some kind, like an unreachable
yes,
reality of
yeah, like something ineffable, something that because of its very nature is just incapable of being consciously accessed or talked about.
but it still kind of has these properties that we're ascribing to it of some kind, even like inaccessible seems to be giving it some existent.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the issue is there's no real way around that. If you want to have a conversation about it, the truest conversation about something like nothing would just be not to talk about it. Um, but if you want to talk about it, there's often a thought that, uh, well, the fact that we can't conceive of it doesn't give us a reason to think that in reality it's not possible. And there's something to that intuition, I think. But ultimately, to the extent that intuition is hitting something true, like I said, the truest way to have a conversation about that is just to totally disregard it and just sort of pretend that it's not there, and you can't infer anything from that, and it doesn't seem like a legitimate way of conceiving of, say, a metaphysics to sort of include at the basis something that, by your own admission, can't be talked about in any coherent or intelligible way.
Right. So there is some sense that you can have a causal chain going back to nothingness, and not have that completely be an irrational process. But
Well,
then,
I wouldn't necessarily say that, because the including of the causal chain, I think, is that would be problematic.
right, because it will just pop out of nothing for no reason.
Yeah, for no reason, and not just that, but connecting up what is with nothing in any linguistic structure would be sort of sinning against the sacred concept, basically. And so, like, there's a sense in which the notion that there could have been nothing is unimpeachable by reason, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think it's permissible to use that recognition in a metaphysical scheme, because the moment it becomes part of a metaphysical scheme, you have violated its nature. It's no longer what you claimed it was. Being part of a metaphysical scheme is anathema to what it's supposed to be.
Right. But we do have people in our community that do want to try and make nothing, something, or kind of like explain it via the necessity of a paradox or the necessity of some kind of equal and opposite force of existing or somethingness. Um, yeah, what kind of issues do you see there with that framing? If we're trying to use some kind of different form of logic, or
Yeah. I mean, it often comes down to the specifics. So a lot of the time, how I relate to that kind of impulse is as by reframing what's meant by nothing, rather than being the complete absence of everything. Instead, I usually think of it as something more like the Tao, right? Like the thing that is beyond particularity, like the mystical one, might be a way of thinking about it, you know?
yeah,
So not nothingness, more like no thingness, right? So no, it doesn't have a particular identity. It's kind of like the all encompassing possibility space, sort of. And often I'll think about it in terms of, okay, it's like the complete absence of any rules, where the culmination of that is a rule that includes anything, basically. You know, like
right,
anything can happen because there's no restriction preventing.
yeah. So it's kind of like an empty set where you've got the possibility for all different sets in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree with I like that interpretation as well. Like the idea that with all possibilities, you've kind of got nothing in some sense. But
yeah,
it's not an absolute nothing. It's a kind of
exactly.
balanced, or it's almost like everything is balanced at nothing or at zero or something.
And I think, you know, that framework, I think it's not how I prefer to think about the world and the way reality works, or the metaphysical ultimate nature of things. But it's not clear to me that that's obviously wrong. You know, I can't rule it out. But it's what I think I can rule out is the idea of, as I was saying before, like if you're dealing with an idea of nothingness as the complete absence of everything, right, and with no exception whatsoever, that seems to me to be a self-contradictory concept. And so, although obviously the fact that, like, okay, I can't wrap my mind around it, that doesn't inherently tell against it. I think that in terms of doing metaphysical philosophy, like I said, there's just no point in talking about that. And if you can make sense of the world by ruling that out, right? If ruling that out makes, and I think, and this I think is part of what I think really tells against it, is it kind of seems that by ruling out nothingness as being logically contradictory, we're given a rationale for thinking that somethingness is necessary, right? Because if in a true dichotomy, if one of the options is logically impossible, then the other one is always true. And
Mm,
so this gives us an answer to questions like, okay, well, what caused existence, you know, or what, and this, the theistic version of this is like, what caused God, right? And the answer is, well, something doesn't have to be caused if there was never another way for things to be, right? The
mm,
whole idea of something being caused presupposes that it could have been not, could have, like that could have been a time when it wasn't, right? And if it's not possible for it to not be, then the whole question of cause goes out the window. We're just dealing with something that sort of always is because it cannot be any other way.
would we call that an uncaused cause?
Yeah, we could call that an uncaused cause. I think that's terminology that is very popular in the history of philosophy. I usually prefer something like a transcendental ground of being, because I think causality, the notion of causality, is often a little confusing. And that's one of the reasons that I often describe data as non contingent rather than an uncaused cause, because I think contingency is a bit of a clearer concept. So contingency is about dependency. So I often think of dependency as a more conceptually clear concept than causality. Causality has polysemy to it. Aristotle had four causes, four types of causes that he thought of. So efficient causality is what we usually mean by cause and effect in modernity. That's the usual concept. And that the picture of that comes to most people's minds, and this is often what's used in science to explain what causality is you have billiard balls, someone hits the first billiard ball, it hits the rest. Movement is distributed throughout all the rest of them because that first one made contact and so transferred its energy or momentum by making contact. There's three other types of causes that Aristotle conceived of. So there's final cause, which is telos, basically. Go back to the name of the channel. So, purpose or end, or so the reason for which an activity is done. So the cause in the sense of, what caused you to go to the market? Well, I wanted to get stuff for lunch, right? And then there's formal cause, which is to do with the shape, right? The actual sort of things that where you locate the reason for something being so in kind of the shape that something has or the way that shape interacts with other things. And the other one is material cause, which is like substance, something of which something is made, basically. And so obviously there's some variance in the notion of cause there. But the usual concept in modernity, like I said, is efficient causality, which is a notion of like sort of dominoes, one thing hits another. And that's where we get the first mover idea, is that the first mover is the originator of the momentum or the motion, the moving. Whereas dependency, I think, is a clearer concept because it doesn't give the sense that the first thing has to necessarily be in motion. It's neutral about the question of motion and change and sort of where motion enters into existence, rather than thinking of the whole sequence of things that exist as something inherently put into motion by that first thing. It sort of leaves in abeyance the question of where motion enters and just asks about dependency, which in a lot of, when we're talking about cause to exist, dependency is really what we mean. When your parents the role your parents played in your existence, right, is obviously they also did the physical movements, required to sort of produce a new life form. But more importantly, you couldn't have existed without them. Like, they're a link in the chain without which you couldn't have been here. Your existence depended on their existence. And that sense of contingency, that idea of, depending on more prior and more primary things, more general things, for the specific way things are, I think is a more it's more neutral with respect to what the overall shape of the scheme ends up looking like and how we would derive kind of the world that we have.
So you think it holds fewer assumptions, like if we follow it back in dependency as opposed to causes, then the thing we find doesn't have to have motion, for example, or
yes, exactly,
be thought of in the same way that we think of
which
causes.
When we were talking about before, like the two ways of thinking about it, one as a first mover and one as, like, say, something that just always contains everything possible. Talking about it in terms of contingency leaves us neutral with respect to which of those options we end up going with. Whereas talking about it in terms of causes inherently predisposes us to believe in one of those two options.
Yeah, I like the framing that we're kind of creating a more neutral starting ground, because that gives us more room to actually philosophize in that space and be like, oh, well, what is possibly going on? And I think we'll probably save the exploration of that for another chat. But
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice framing of it. And I think there's only one more topic that we haven't talked about, and maybe it sort of relates into this more neutral foundational ground that you've described, and that's the fine-tuning problem. Like, why this universe? Why this reality? Why
Yeah,
such a reality that can support life specifically, which seems like so rare in the universe, and
exactly.
considering the time that the universe has been around and the vastness of the universe. Not that we've got our eyes everywhere, but
Yeah.
yeah, this.
No, I think that's a really good place to end as well, because I think that it's one of those things that is really good food for thought. It's stimulating to the imagination, you know. Um, and the fine tuning problem really sort of pivots on this idea that uh, brute facts in terms of, say, the laws of physics or something like that, are not an acceptable place to rest. They don't provide us with an explanation, you know. So sometimes people just say, well, okay, the fine tuning problem, the universe is a specific way, like you said, that results in sort of the possibility of life. And there's a whole bunch of ways it could have been, logically possible ways the world could have been, that therefore aren't ruled out in principle. Why is this the one that exists rather than any other way, you know? And some people who are quite enthralled to a physicalist or scientistic worldview might say, no, there's no it just is that way. That's just all there is. It just is that way. And I think that strikes a lot of us as not a satisfactory answer, you know.
Well, it stops the conversation, right? It's kind of like,
Yeah, yeah,
because it is, and then like, then talk to me about that.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. There's a sense in which the person is just saying, not only that you can't know, we can't know, but there is no answer. And I always feel compelled to ask, well, how do you know that? You know, like it seems far from clear that there's no reason to want an explanation there. I think that the usual, the kind of seed intuition of explanatory inquiry in general is the idea that there are reasons for things being how they are. There's a really great example in a book on the subject of the principle of sufficient reason by Alexander Pruss, where he kind of says, you know, imagine a situation where there was an aircraft crash, you know, and there's sort of investigators and they sort of look for a reason and they can't find one. And then so they're asked to do a report, and in the report they just say, there is no reason. There was no reason. And, you know, he kind of says, it's very difficult to imagine anyone accepting that. You know, the usual thought is, well, all you're saying is you couldn't figure out the reason. You know, there's some reason, but you just don't know what it is. The suggestion that there really wasn't a reason it strikes most of us as deeply counterintuitive. And that sort of intuition, I think, generalizes to really any problem that we set our minds to. We always have the thought, this is kind of, I think, central to the whole explanatory enterprise, is that things being the way they are, happening the way they do, there's always some reason to make that so. That's what we would usually call that the principle of sufficient reason. You know, anything that is, anything that happens, anything that exists has some sufficient reason why it does, why it is the way it is, and so on.
Yeah, and this harkens back to a question that I asked earlier as well, which is, what would a explanation look like that would be, you know, acceptable by a kind of mainstream audience or a scientifically minded audience? Because one of the issues I think with, you know, like, oh, we can't know, or even worse is that, you know, we don't have the faculties to possibly know. You know, not just that I don't know, or that you know, it's like we literally as human beings cannot know these answers, is another framing of it. I think is an issue of not all the time, but one of the issues is of empiricism, of assuming that all of our knowledge has to fit into the facts or the framework of an empirical study, which is one of space-time and contingent causality, and I don't know. It just feels like what would the answer to the question, what would proof or an answer look like that would satisfy people, is like, it's a difficult question, I think, and maybe one that we'll have to address in a different
Yeah.
conversation, perhaps.
I think as a baseline, what people look for in an explanation is that it actually resolves the mystery. We ask questions for a reason. Things seem strange or mysterious to us, and ultimately, maybe like the most primitive mark of the adequacy of an answer is whether we can stop wondering about it after we've heard it.
Right. Yeah, and we have a separate talk, which hopefully we can link up on the screen, about the requirements of
Yeah,
a theory of everything, which I think will answer some of those questions, and
definitely.
various other conversations we no doubt have about these topics. But yeah, I think you're right. It's a good time to, maybe we can wrap it up and
Yeah, definitely.
um, yeah, call it a day. It's good chatting with you. Always a pleasure.
Definitely. And thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah. See you later.